A merrier Christmas, Bob, my good fellow, than I have given you for many a year.
Dickens refers to food and drink over 5,000 times.
Dickens looked around him, I think, and looked at the extreme contrasts he could see in Victorian London at the time.
Scrooge was better than his word. He did it all, and infinitely more.
None of the others have the fire of A Christmas Carol, and I think it's because A Christmas Carol was written with such an intention. It was written to change the world.
I think one of the things you've got to remember at this point is he's very conscious of who his audience are.
I think there's probably the sense that Turkey was a sort of goose on steroids. You know, it was the next best thing up.
I think the interesting thing about Dickens was he is a full-on performer.
Make up the fires and buy another coal scuttle before you dot another I, Bob Cratchit.
Scrooge was better than his word. He did it all, and infinitely more. And to Tiny Tim, who did not die, he was a second father. He became as good a friend, as good a master, and as good a man as the good old city knew, or any other good old city, town, or borough in the good old world.
Welcome back to Inimitable, the podcast brought to you by the Charles Dickens Museum. A Christmas Carol is more than just a book. It has become iconic. It has become synonymous with Christmas itself. And what's fascinating is that's not really an accident. This was a book in which Dickens poured every ounce of his being, every skill that he had as a writer. He was determined that this story should, as he put it, be a hammer blow for the poor. He wanted it to make a difference. And that meant not just writing a good story, it meant producing a brilliant product which people would see on the shelves and want to buy. Dickens was a very good marketing man. So for this episode, I want to look at how the physical book came to be created, with illustrations, with binding. What was the process of creating a book which would become a literary masterpiece? But to begin our journey, I want to go right back to the beginning. Where was Dickens in his career in 1843 as he set out to write this Christmas story? So to answer these questions, I spoke to Lucinda Dickens Hawksley, author of Dickens and Christmas, patron of the Charles Dickens Museum, and 3 times great-granddaughter of Charles Dickens himself, as well as Dr Cindy Sughrue, the museum director. Today, of course, we think of A Christmas Carol. I mean, it's probably the most famous story Dickens wrote. It's so synonymous with Dickens. But in 1843, things weren't going that well for Dickens. He perhaps wasn't the massive star we think of him as today. Can you tell us a bit about Dickens's career up until that point?
Well, Dickens had been immensely famous very quickly. So when he was living in the house that we're now sitting in, Charles Dickens Museum, 48 Doughty Street in London, he'd arrived as a fairly well-known writer who was doing well. People in London definitely knew who he was, but he wasn't yet really famous. But by the time he left, just 2.5 years later, he wasn't just incredibly famous in Britain, he was incredibly famous overseas as well. He was receiving letters from all over the world, and his works have been translated into several languages. I believe Russian and French, and apparently Croatian was one of the first languages that he was translated into. And so people were reading Dickens all over the world. And initially it seemed he could do no wrong. And then in 1842, Dickens and his wife Catherine went off to America for what was to be Charles Dickens's first trip. They went to North America, the USA and Canada. Now, While they were there, Dickens was lionised, and it's often been compared to when the Beatles first went to America. People were thrilled by this writer, and he'd become very, very famous through his work. And Nicholas Nickleby, Old Curiosity Shop, particularly Oliver Twist. People loved these books in America. When he came back, he thought he'd try something different. So he wrote what he'd been longing to write about travel, and he wrote his first travelogue, American Notes. And unfortunately, most people just didn't get it. Travel writing was very niche at this time. Not that many people really understood it that well. And people just thought, what's this book by Dickens? There's no plot. So it was really like his journalism, which was popular, but people weren't quite sure what to make of it. And then he wrote his next novel, Martin Chuzzlewit, which I think is a really great book, but for some reason, it just didn't capture the imagination of the reading public in the same way that his previous novels had done. So for the first time, when one of Dickens's novels was being serialised, and as you know, all of his books came out in serial form, all of his major novels, not his Christmas books. So he hadn't written them and then was just publishing them in instalments. He had a deadline for every week or every month. And he just, he kept writing them while his audience was reading them. And normally that really kind of garnered great attention. But for some reason with that one, people just didn't like it as much. And perhaps because he put quite a lot of his time in America in there. He used it for Martin's travels to the States. He was very funny about it. But people just didn't love it as much as the others. And his publishers started thinking, you know what? Maybe he's had his time. Maybe he's not the rising star that we thought. Dickens was overdrawn at the bank as a result of this, and he was scared because his father had been in debtor's prison. And being overdrawn at the bank then wasn't like today where you probably have an overdraft facility. It was a really frightening thing to be, particularly as a man with young children and all sorts of financial responsibilities. His family were constantly relying on him. I don't just mean his wife and children, his siblings, his parents, his uncles. They all relied on him to give them handouts as soon as he'd got famous. And when he came up with the idea for A Christmas Carol, and he told his publishers, Chapman and Hall, that he had this idea for a little book about Christmas, would you believe that they thought that was a very uncommercial subject, that no one was going to want to read about Christmas?
You couldn't believe that today, could you? Absolutely not.
But the reason we couldn't believe it today is because Dickens basically created the Christmas story industry. Now, he wasn't the first to write stories about Christmas, and notably the American author Washington Irving had written a couple of lovely stories about Christmas, which Dickens read as a child and really enjoyed. But he turned it into an industry. Charles Dickens' writing of A Christmas Carol was instantly successful.
Absolutely. And although Dickens wrote it in a very quick 6 weeks, he'd been formulating the idea for a while. But yes, wrote it in 6 weeks, and it was published on the 19th of December 1843, 6,000 copies, all of which had sold out by Christmas Eve in 6 days. So it's all about the six. Wrote it in 6 weeks, 6,000 copies, sold out in 6 days, and in fact it was reprinted 6 more times over the next 6 months, and it's never been out of print since. So it was a massive hit.
But because his publishers didn't have a huge amount of faith in him, and he wanted to have these beautiful hand-tinted illustrations by his great friend, the illustrator John Leech, who went on to become extremely famous himself as one of the top cartoonists in Punch, but was quite little known in 1843. And the publishers just said, that's way too expensive. You'll have to pay for those. So in essence, Dickens partially self-published A Christmas Carol. Now, so Chapman and Hall would not pay all of the production costs, which meant that Dickens's costs were really sky high. But of course, it took a while for those royalties to start to trickle through. And he'd had a really tough year. So when he was writing A Christmas Carol, and he was writing about the Cratchit family's poverty, and he placed them in Camden Town, a place that he knew well. That, for him, was a symbol of where he'd had to live when his father was in the debtor's prison. And this was the area of London that he associated with meanness and poverty. All of those things must have been coming back to him. Would his children ever end up, as his siblings had been, living in a cell in a prison with their parents?
You're so right. I mean, I'd never really thought about it like that. But I suppose when you put it in that context of he's overdrawn at the bank, then he's told you've got to pay for half the publication cost yourself. So effectively he's going to be even more overdrawn than he was already. And his sales at that point were going down. So there was no guarantee that this was going to work, that he was going to get that financial return. I mean, this was a huge gamble on his part. It must have taken a huge amount of self-belief to think that that story was going to work.
It really was a huge gamble, but I think he absolutely did believe in it.
I mean, it's such a brilliantly crafted work, and I know what it's like if I have to work to a really tight deadline, and once he formulated the idea of A Christmas Carol, he thought, I've got to get it out in time for Christmas, obviously. Working to a deadline under pressure, you don't have time to rethink and rework, and sometimes reworking can lose something. The urgency of this work, it's conveyed along. You feel the speed at which he's writing as you read it. And I think the urgency, and it's full of fun and laughter and joy, but it's also making this message in a way that is so powerful. I think it's the rate at which he wrote, the urgency, his sense of being determined to do something that comes out in the real energy and purpose and success of the novel.
It's amazing, isn't it, to think that A Christmas Carol is probably the most famous novella in history, and yet Dickens had to argue with his publishers to get them to agree to release it. I mean, isn't that just balmy? And it shows really that sometimes editors and publishers, apologies if some of our listeners are editors and publishers, but sometimes they get it wrong. Now, if I asked you to just close your eyes for a moment and just in your mind picture Ebenezer Scrooge, or the ghost of Jacob Marley with his clanking chains and cash boxes, or perhaps the ghost of Christmas Present in his green fur robe and his throne of food, you can probably picture exactly what I'm talking about. The imagery of A Christmas Carol, no matter the number of adaptations there have been, has never really changed. These illustrations are, of course, taken straight from the book, from Dickens's descriptions, but also from the illustrations that were included in the first edition. To tell us more about these iconic images, I spoke to Dr. Frankie Kubicki and Emma Harper, the curators of the Charles Dickens Museum.
Yeah, so these are 3 preparatory sketches done by John Leach for A Christmas Carol. And what that means is they're rough sketches, they're pencil, and yet despite that, they've got such character in them. The one I'm looking at the moment, it's got the ghost of Christmas Present, so a big, what we would call Father Christmas style character in the centre, and Scrooge with his little bed hat on, cowering in the corner. And what's beautiful about this is that if you showed me this illustration today completely out of context, not talking about Christmas Carol, I would be able to recognise that that is Scrooge, even to this day. So it really shows the power of illustrations, and also what a good job John Leach did. He used to work for Punch, so he's familiar with, creating quite memorable caricatures and characters in his illustrations. And actually there's a letter from Dickens praising him that also says he's always kind in his illustrations, but always has this ability to deliver a sermon if he needs to. And obviously that is exactly what Dickens needs him to do in this case.
Yeah, you're so right. I mean, looking at that now, isn't that a beautiful image? I mean, it is this huge figure of the well, it's a tiny sketch, but it's a huge figure.
Yeah, huge presence.
Exactly, huge presence of the ghost of Christmas Present. And as you say, if you had never seen these illustrations, if you'd never seen a Leach illustration before, you would look at this and instantly, that's Scrooge, that's the ghost of Christmas Present. Is that why Dickens wants these illustrations in his book?
I think one of the things you've got to remember at this point is he's very conscious of who his audience are. And yes, they are readers, but a lot of them might not have been. So you've got this case where someone might be reading out the story to a family around the fireplace, traditional Victorian image, and not everyone would have been able to read it for themselves. Illiteracy was quite hard. So these illustrations help to bring that story to life and widen the audience and really capture their imagination.
That image of Scrooge in particular, how many adaptations of A Christmas Carol have there been? How many more picture books? How many more movies? Scrooge hasn't changed.
No, he did something right, because you don't need to change it.
Absolutely. Speaking of Scrooge now, tell us about this next one. It's a Leach illustration as well, and I recognise this image straight away.
So here we're looking at Scrooge sitting by the fire being confronted by the ghost of his old business partner, Marley. Marley is quite noticeable because he is carrying the chains of his misdeeds. And we always think here when we look at the sketch, you have to note that he's wearing a little ponytail as well. One of my favourite bits about this drawing. It's a seminal part in the story because, of course, it's the beginning of what, the transformation that Scrooge is going to go under. He goes from he can't believe it's Marley, he believes that it's something he ate, to really understanding that to enjoy his life, he has to be a better person and he has to give and care for those around him.
And it's beautiful, isn't it? I mean, just looking at this now, obviously it's a black and white illustration, it's pencil on paper, but you can feel it, can't you? I mean, you're looking at it, and I can hear Dickens's words in my head, and you can almost feel the coldness of the weather and everything that goes along with it. It's so powerful, isn't it?
It's incredible because you look at it and actually there are very few lines on the drawing. There's not much substance to it in a way. But like you say, you can really feel it, and Scrooge is sort of huddling up to the fireplace where, as we know, there's not really going to be a big fire in there, but you can feel him kind of trying to warm himself and shrink away from the appearance of Marley. And yes, just thinking, is this the drop of cheese that I had at
Yes.
Dickens?
More of gravy than of grave
I
about
know,
you.
too,
It's so iconic. And I think that tiny little illustration that's in front of us, this is the first time essentially that Scrooge has been put to artwork. That's incredible that we have that here at the museum.
And it's only about 3 inches square, if that.
And you can just see from the tiny details that Leach, as this fantastic artist, is just working out the scene and what they're going to convey with this image.
Absolutely. I know the fact there as well that it's a preparatory image. After he had created them, you just thought maybe he'd just screwed up and throw it in the bin because he didn't need it anymore. But here it is.
Thankfully, he didn't.
Exactly.
Yeah, exactly.
And there's one more image that I know you've got here, that one of George Leach's illustrations. And again, I mean, this is the power of Leach, really. It's just so instantly recognisable. Tell us about this one.
So here we have a rather animated pencil sketch again by Leach of Fezziwig's ball. So Fezziwig within the Christmas Carol is obviously the lively, joyful spirit of Christmas within Scrooge's life, and it's wonderful to see him dancing.
What's really nice is that, so this becomes the title page. And even though this is black and white and in the end it's colour, as we've mentioned, you can really feel the animation. Fezziwig's got a big smile on his face. He's underneath the mistletoe, and it's a real family gathering. There are a couple having a little cuddle in the corner in the background. There are children watching the dancing, and the violinist on his fiddle on a little gallery up top is also surveying the scene. So it's a really jolly Christmas party.
You're so right, and again, you're looking at it as quite a small, quite a basic image in many ways, but you can feel the music, can't you? You can feel the movement, and to think that Dickens, through A Christmas Carol, I know he didn't create Christmas, but he very much popularised it, and I think these illustrations play almost quite a key role in that transformation, don't they?
And there would have been things that the audience reading A Christmas Carol, they would have recognised these things as happening around Christmas. It wouldn't have been completely foreign to them. As you say, he didn't create Christmas, but he really embedded it in people's mentality, and it's that message throughout the whole story of the good of Christmas, that you must live it in your heart all the year round, things like that. And it's this double message, which you quite often get with Dickens, of that personal nature and character, but also the really serious issue of the poverty and how everyone has a role to play in changing society.
I love these preparatory sketches because on one hand, as Emma said, they're quite basic. They're literally pencil on paper. But you can instantly see the characters that would become so iconic. And the fact that we've got the very first images of Scrooge, of Jacob Marley, ever produced, it gives you goosebumps, really, to think about it. And I think what these images demonstrate is that to Dickens, A Christmas Carol was more than just a book or a story. It was, as he said in the preface, an idea. What's fascinating is that even after A Christmas Carol was released, Dickens was not quite finished with it.
So here we've got a trial edition of A Christmas Carol. It's got a lovely kind of browny salmon colour cover and some gold decorative illustration on the front. But what's really lovely is as we open it up to the title page, you've got one lovely colour illustration by John Leech of Mr. Fezziwig's Ball. And on the title page it says A Christmas Carol in prose, being a ghost story of Christmas. But here Dickens is playing around with the colour a little bit. So here A Christmas Carol is in red, and then you've got the other writing in green. Dickens really liked green as a colour, and obviously it has associations with the Christmas period as well. But actually what he found was it wasn't as effective in the printing, which is why he goes back to the red and blue.
So this shows that Dickens is changing his mind, or changing the way it's printed. What was this coming from, the publishers, or was this coming from Dickens?
Dickens had a really clear idea of what he wanted this book to be. For him, it was, of course, the story, but actually it was this creation of this beautiful little gift book that came in a package that he really drove the design of. He knew that he wanted a salmon cover, so salmon pink cover. He knew that he wanted beautiful gilding around the edges of the page, and as Emma has said, at the front of the book and on the spine. And he also knew that he wanted hand-coloured illustrations. Of course, at this point, they can't print in colour the way we do today, which is a fantastically laborious process and something that, of course, therefore was really expensive. And for Dickens, he was really pushing at the margins of production because he wanted this book to be this beautiful thing, but he also didn't want it to be too expensive. He wanted people to be able to buy it. And it's very interesting because from its conception, these ideas were driven by Dickens himself.
Understanding how Dickens made A Christmas Carol physically, how he created the book, I think is really revealing. Because what it shows us is that Dickens, first of all, was a very keen producer. He knew what he was selling. It wasn't just a story, it was a product. But I think also it shows us why A Christmas Carol became so wildly popular. Because it wasn't just another story released in a magazine. It was a brilliant piece of literature, but which came out looking beautiful and attractive, and it contained these glorious illustrations, which captured the spirit of the story, which were recognisable to people, even those who couldn't read or write. In many ways, you could say Dickens created a brand which was recognisable and which continues to be recognisable to this day. But I think perhaps it tells us something else too. A Christmas Carol was a story which was designed to change people, to change hearts, to make people realise, pay attention to the world around them. It was also a book which in many ways would appeal more to the middle class, those who could afford a beautifully bound, illustrated book. And we've got to ask ourselves, is that an accident? The very people who were in the best position to do something about poverty, about suffering in the world, they were the target market, and they were the people Dickens wrote this book to. They were not, however, the people he wrote the book for. A Christmas Carol was written to help the poor, and nothing illustrates this more than the harrowing scene, ignorance and want. In the next episode, we're going to take an in-depth look at these characters. Who were the children, ignorance and want? Why did Dickens include them in his story? And what do they tell us about the purpose of A Christmas Carol?
Britain was becoming this kind of world power. Britain loved to see itself as a kind of global power.
They were the children that Dickens wrote the whole book about.
It's a really interesting time because I think something that Dickens feels here is fear for his future.
I think he's describing the worst cases of starvation and disease.
Inimitable is produced and presented by me, Jordan Evans-Hill. Our contributors are Dr Cindy Sughrue, Dr Frankie Kubicki and Emma Harper, as well as Dr Lee Jackson, Pen Vogler, Lucinda Hawksley, Miriam Margolyes and Simon Callow. Thanks for listening.